The assignment. Captain Ron Taylor leaned back in his chair, staring at the holographic briefing projected in front of him. The Interstellar Protection Agency rarely gave him a day off, but this new assignment promised to be unlike anything he'd handled before. His job: guard an alien geisha named Leshera, a cultural ambassador from the distant Zenari system. On the surface, it seemed simple. Escort her to events, keep her safe, and ensure no harm came her way. But Ron had a knack for spotting trouble before it arrived, and something about this job set off alarms in his head. Why would a cultural ambassador need a top-tier bodyguard like him? And why did the message accompanying his orders mention high-priority secrecy? He tapped the edge of his badge, signing. Another day, another mission. He muttered as his transport ship docked at the bustling diplomatic hub planet of Zelora. The docking bay was alive with activity, shimmering with holographic signs, and bustling aliens of every kind. As Ron stepped off his ship, a sleek robot attendant approached him. "Welcome, Captain Taylor," the robot's voice buzzed. "Your charge, Leshera, awaits in the Sapphire Suite." Ron nodded and followed the machine, his sharp eyes scanning the area. Zelora was neutral territory, home to ambassadors, traders, and diplomats from every corner of the galaxy. It was supposed to be safe, but Ron had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. The Sapphire Suite was as grand as its name suggested. The walls glittered with soft blue light, and the air smelled faintly of exotic flowers. Standing in the middle of the room was Leshera. She was taller than Ron had expected, her skin shimmering like polished silver under the room's lights. Her eyes, large and glowing with a faint purple hue, studied him carefully. "So, you're my protector," she said, her voice as smooth as flowing water. She moved with the grace of a dancer, her robes trailing behind her like rippling waves. "I've heard humans are efficient." Ron wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an insult, but he nodded. "I get the job done." Leshera smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Let's hope so. My life depends on it." Ron's instincts prickled as she led him to a side chamber. The room was quieter, more private. Leshera gestured for him to sit, her expression suddenly serious. "This isn't just about protecting me from physical harm," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There are forces at play, Captain. Powerful forces that want to silence me. You're not just guarding me. You're guarding secrets that could reshape the galaxy." Ron raised an eyebrow. "What kind of secrets?" Leshera hesitated, her gaze darting toward the door, as if someone might be listening. "Not yet. I can't say more until I know I can trust you." Ron leaned back, crossing his arms. "If you want me to do my job, I need to know what I'm up against." She sighed, her glowing eyes dimming slightly. "Let's just say, there are those who fear unity. My role as an ambassador isn't just symbolic. My presence here threatens their plans." Before Ron could press further, the room's lights flickered. A chill ran down his spine as he instinctively reached for his weapon. Leshera stood, her movements fluid but tense. "They're already watching." The rest of the day was a blur of preparations. Ron checked the security systems, studied the layouts of every venue they were scheduled to visit, and discreetly questioned staff members about any unusual activity. Yet, no matter how thorough he was, he couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was just around the corner. That night, as he stood guard outside Leshera's quarters, a shadow moved at the edge of his vision. He turned sharply, his weapon at the ready, but there was nothing there, just the hum of distant machinery and the faint glow of the suite's lights. "Paranoia suits you." Leshera's voice came from behind him. She was leaning against the doorway, her expression unreadable. "But it won't be enough." Ron frowned. "What aren't you telling me?" Leshera didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Protect me well, Captain. If you fail, it won't just be my life that's lost. The entire galaxy will pay the price." Ron tightened his grip on his weapon, his resolve hardening. This was no ordinary assignment, and if Leshera was right, The stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. The first part of the assignment was clear: keep her alive and figure out who was after her. But as Ron settled into his post that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. "Guard the geisha," he muttered to himself. "How hard can it be?" Somewhere in the shadows, a pair of unseen eyes watched, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first encounter. Ron Taylor stood at the edge of the lavish gala hall, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. The venue, a grand crystalline dome overlooking Zalora's endless starlit skies, was buzzing with activity. Diplomats from dozens of alien species mingled, their laughter and conversation blending with the soft hum of a live orchestral band playing instruments that shimmered with each note. At the center of it all was Lishera, draped in flowing silks that changed colors with her movements. She seemed to glide rather than walk. Her presence was magnetic, and every eye in the room was drawn to her, either in admiration or envy. "Stay close," Ron muttered into his comlink, his voice low and firm. He didn't trust the peaceful facade of the gala. It was too perfect, too orderly, and Ron knew perfection was often a mask for chaos waiting to erupt. From his vantage point, he could see several potential threats. A group of stern-faced Karev diplomats exchanged whispers near the edge of the room. Their body language was sharp, calculated. To Ron's left, a pair of human businessmen laughed a little too loudly, their hands twitching near their concealed holsters. And then there were the shadows, figures that hovered at the edges of the grand dome, just out of sight, but close enough to spark his instincts. Lishera, oblivious or uncaring about the danger, moved through the crowd with ease. She bowed gracefully to a delegation of reptilian Xarn, her melodic voice cutting through the din as she spoke their language fluently. They responded with deep, rumbling laughs, clearly charmed by her. Ron kept his distance but remained alert. His earpiece crackled, and a voice came through. It was Jenna, the operations coordinator back at headquarters. "Ron, everything looks clear on our end, but stay vigilant. The intel suggests there might be someone targeting her tonight." "Noted," Ron replied curtly. He didn't need intel to tell him that. As the night went on, Ron's unease grew. His suspicions were confirmed when a man in a dark cloak approached him, slipping a folded note into his hand before vanishing into the crowd. The movement was so quick, so seamless, that anyone else might have missed it. But not Ron. He opened the note discreetly, keeping his expression neutral as he read the hastily scrawled message. "They're watching. Protect her well, or the galaxy burns." The words sent a chill down his spine. He crumpled the note and stuffed it into his pocket, scanning the room again. The masked man was gone, but now Ron felt eyes on him from every direction. "Captain." Lishera's voice brought him back to focus. She was standing beside him, her glowing eyes filled with concern. "You're tense." Ron didn't respond immediately. Instead, he positioned himself slightly in front of her, shielding her from the crowd. "We need to move. Now." Lishera frowned. "Why?" "The night is young, and there are so many." "Trust me," Ron cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. To her credit, Lishera didn't protest further. She nodded and allowed him to lead her toward the exit. But before they could leave, the lights dimmed, plunging the room into an eerie half-darkness. The orchestra stopped playing, and a hush fell over the crowd. A loud voice echoed through the hall, amplified by unseen speakers. It was deep and commanding, laced with menace. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but some secrets cannot be allowed to leave this room." Ron's hand was already on his weapon as he pulled Lishera behind a pillar. The crowd erupted into chaos, with people shouting and scrambling for cover. From the shadows, masked figures emerged, armed with sleek, advanced weapons that hummed with energy. The attackers moved with precision, sealing off exits and herding the crowd into the center of the room. One of them, a tall figure in crimson armor, stepped forward and pointed directly at Lishera. "She is the key," the figure announced. "Hand her over, and no one else will be harmed. Lyshera's grip on Ron's arm tightened. "They can't have me," she whispered, her voice trembling but determined. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I'm starting to get the picture," Ron muttered. He pulled his sidearm and scanned their surroundings. The attackers had the advantage of numbers and positioning, but Ron wasn't one to give up easily. "Stay close," he told Lyshera as he activated his tactical visor. It lit up with data, highlighting weak points in the attackers' formation. Ron smirked. They might have planned for a cultural gala, but they hadn't planned for him. The first shot rang out, a brilliant streak of blue energy that grazed the pillar Ron and Lyshera were hiding behind. Ron responded immediately, firing a calculated burst that hit one of the attackers square in the chest. The room erupted into chaos once more as panicked guests ran for cover. "Move," Ron barked, guiding Lyshera toward a side exit he'd scouted earlier. He covered their retreat with well-placed shots, each one taking down an enemy with ruthless efficiency. As they reached the exit, Ron noticed something strange. One of the attackers wasn't firing. Instead, they stood motionless, watching him with an almost curious gaze. Before Ron could process this, the figure raised a hand in a strange salute and melted back into the shadows. Outside the dome, Ron ushered Lyshera into a waiting transport. As they sped away, he glanced at her. She was shaken but composed, her glowing eyes staring out of the city lights. "What aren't you telling me?" Ron demanded, his tone sharp. Lyshera hesitated before meeting his gaze. "They don't want me dead, Captain. They want what I carry. And if they get it, the galaxy won't survive." Ron gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on the controls. This mission was becoming more dangerous by the second. But one thing was clear: failure wasn't an option. And somewhere, in the shadows of the night, the Watchers were already planning their next move: the ambush. The convoy glided silently through the neon-lit streets of Zilora. Ron Taylor sat in the lead transport vehicle, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, and every pedestrian. The city, with its towering holographic billboards and bustling marketplaces, was alive with activity, but Ron's focus was entirely on the job. Behind him, in the second transport, Lyshera sat quietly, her shimmering robes casting faint glows in the dim interior. Two other agents flanked her, both armed and alert. Ron had chosen them personally, veterans with sharp instincts and steady hands. Still, something about the mission didn't sit right with him. "Convoy leader to all units," Ron said it into his comlink. "Stay sharp. No unnecessary stops. No distractions. We're going straight to the diplomatic compound." A chorus of acknowledgments followed, but Ron's gut told him it wouldn't be that simple. It never was. The ambush came just as they entered a quieter part of the city, a stretch of road lined with abandoned warehouses. Ron didn't like the detour, but the main routes had been deemed too crowded and risky for an escort of this importance. As the convoy turned a corner, the first sign of trouble appeared: a small maintenance drone hovering near a lamppost. It looked innocuous, but Ron's visor flashed a warning: unauthorized device detected. "Stop the convoy," Ron barked, but it was too late. The drone exploded in a burst of blinding light, sending the lead transport spinning. Ron's vehicle skidded to a halt, its reinforced chassis absorbing most of the blast, but the second transport wasn't as lucky. A massive shockwave hit it, flipping it onto its side. Ron stumbled out of his vehicle, coughing as smoke and debris filled the air. His visor adjusted automatically, highlighting the figures emerging from the shadows. Mercenaries, heavily armed, and moving with military precision. "Protect Lyshera," Ron shouted into his comm. He drew his plasma sidearm and took cover behind the wreckage of the lead vehicle. The mercenaries opened fire, energy bolts zipping through the air and illuminating the chaos. Inside the overturned transport, Lyshera struggled to free herself from the restraints. One of the agents beside her was unconscious, a deep cut on his forehead. The other was awake but disoriented, fumbling for his weapon. "We're under attack," she said, her voice calm despite the situation. "Can you fight?" The agent nodded weakly, clutching his weapon as Lyshera managed to pry herself loose. She pressed her hand against a concealed panel on her robes, and a faint shield shimmered around her. It wouldn't hold against sustained fire, but it would buy her time. Outside, Ron was already engaging the attackers. His shots were precise, each one finding its mark. But for every mercenary he took down, two more seemed to appear. They were well equipped, their armor absorbing most standard energy rounds. "These aren't just hired guns," Ron muttered, ducking behind cover as a volley of plasma fire scorched the ground nearby. "They're trained." The sound of heavy footsteps drew Ron's attention. A hulking figure emerged from the smoke, clad in reinforced armor and wielding a weapon that looked more like a small cannon. The mercenary leader, Ron guessed. "You have something we want," the leader growled, his voice amplified by a built-in speaker. "Hand her over, and you might live." Ron smirked, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. "You'll have to do better than that." The leader raised his cannon, and Ron barely had time to dive as a massive energy blast obliterated the vehicle he'd been using for cover. The shockwave threw him to the ground, his ears ringing. In the midst of the chaos, Lyshera emerged from the wreckage of her transport, her shield flickering as it absorbed stray shots. She moved with surprising agility, her glowing eyes scanning the battlefield. "Captain," she called out, her voice cutting through the din. Ron scrambled to his feet, his weapon at the ready. "Stay back." "Ill." Before he could finish, Lyshera raised her hands. A wave of shimmering energy erupted from her, sending the nearest mercenaries flying. For a moment, the battlefield was silent, the attackers staring in shock. "What was that?" Ron muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. Lyshera didn't answer. Her glowing eyes dimmed slightly, and she stumbled, clearly drained from the effort. "She's the target," the mercenary leader roared. "Capture her alive." The attackers surged forward, and Ron knew they were out of time. He grabbed Lyshera's arm, pulling her toward a nearby alley. "Move, we're not winning this fight." The alley was narrow and dark, the perfect escape route. Ron led Lyshera through a maze of back streets, his sharp ears picking up the sounds of pursuit. He activated his comlink. "HQ, this is Taylor. We've been hit. The convoy is compromised. Requesting immediate extraction." Static crackled in his earpiece before a faint voice responded. "Understood, Captain. Extraction in 10 minutes. Hold your position." 10 minutes, Ron muttered, glancing at Lyshera. "We'll need to make them count." They ducked into an abandoned building, the walls covered in peeling paint and graffiti. Ron quickly barricaded the entrance, turning to Lyshera. "What did you do back there?" Lyshera hesitated, her gaze distant. "It's complicated, but that power is why they're after me." Ron sighed, leaning against the wall. "You could have mentioned that earlier." The sound of boots echoed in the distance, growing louder. The mercenaries were closing in. Ron checked his weapon, his jaw tightening. "Stay behind me. If they want you, they'll have to go through me first." Lyshera nodded, her expression unreadable. "I hope you're as good as they say, Captain." The next few minutes would determine their survival, and the fate of secrets that could reshape the galaxy. The revelation. The extraction vessel soared through Zelora's dense skyline, leaving the chaos of the ambush far behind. Inside, Ron sat across from Lyshera in the dimly lit cabin, his body aching from bruises and burns. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him with a flood of unanswered questions. Lyshera was silent, her glowing eyes fixed on the small window as stars streaked by. She looked exhausted, her shimmering robes torn and smeared with dirt, but her regal demeanor remained intact. Ron couldn't take the silence any longer. "We nearly died back there," he said, his voice sharp. "I think it's time you told me what's really going on." Lyshera's gaze shifted to him, her expression unreadable. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me," Ron shot back, I've just fought off a squad of mercenaries armed with military-grade tech. They weren't just after a diplomat. They were after you. Specifically. So, forgive me if I'm a little curious." Lishara sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. For the first time, she looked vulnerable. "You've heard of the Zanari archives, haven't you?" Ron frowned. The Zanari were known for their ancient knowledge, libraries of data and wisdom collected over millennia. "Yeah, they're supposed to be some kind of galactic treasure. What about them?" Lishara leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The archives aren't just data. They contain the blueprints for something far more dangerous, the Eternium Protocol." Ron's brow furrowed. "Never heard of it." "Most haven't," Lishara replied. "The Eternium Protocol is an ancient failsafe, a weapon designed to ensure the survival of the Zanari at all costs. It can manipulate entire star systems, destabilizing them or turning them into energy sources, if it falls into the wrong hands." Her voice trailed off, but Ron didn't need her to finish. "So, you're saying you have access to this thing?" "Not just access," she admitted. "I am the key. The knowledge to activate it was encoded into my DNA at birth. That's why they want me. If they capture me and extract the code..." She closed her eyes, her voice trembling. "Billions could die." Ron leaned back, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't just a protection detail anymore. It was a galactic crisis. He had suspected something big was at stake. But this was on another level. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" he asked, his tone harsh. Lishara met his gaze, her own eyes hardening. "Because the fewer people who know, the better. Even now, by telling you, I've increased the danger. If they capture you, they'll torture you for information." Ron smirked humorlessly. "Let them try." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, interrupting the tense moment. "We're approaching the secure zone, Captain. ETA 5 minutes. Ron stood, pacing the small cabin. "So what's the plan?" "You can't stay here on Zalora. It's compromised. We need to get you off-world." Lishara nodded. "Agreed. But there's something else you should know. The Eternium Protocol isn't just a weapon. It's also a beacon." "A beacon," Ron echoed, stopping mid-step. She hesitated, as if weighing whether to tell him the full truth. Finally, she said, "It's a signal to an ancient Zanari fleet, ships that have been dormant for thousands of years. If the protocol is activated, they'll awaken, but their loyalty is unpredictable. They may protect the galaxy, or they may destroy it." Ron stared at her, his mind racing. "So it's not just about keeping you alive. It's about keeping this thing from ever being activated." "Exactly," Lishara said softly. "Which is why we must stay one step ahead of our enemies. If they corner me, if they force me to unlock the code, we're all doomed." The transport docked at a secure hangar, where a team of heavily armed guards waited to escort them. Ron and Lishara stepped off the ship, the tension between them palpable. "Captain Taylor," said a stern-looking officer who approached them. "We've secured the area. The ambassador will be safe here." Ron shook his head. "No, she won't." The officer frowned. "Excuse me." "This isn't just about safety," Ron said. "The people after her won't stop until they get what they want. We need to stay mobile, unpredictable. Keeping her in one place is a death sentence." Lishara looked at him, surprised. "You're willing to take that risk?" Ron smirked. "You hired me to keep you alive, remember? I don't do things halfway." The officer didn't seem convinced, but Ron didn't care. He had made up his mind. "Prep a ship. We're leaving within the hour." Later, as they boarded a sleek, unmarked vessel, Ron couldn't shake the weight of Lishara's revelation. The stakes were higher than he'd ever faced, and the line between friend and enemy was growing blurrier by the second. Lishara stood beside him in the cockpit, her gaze fixed on the stars ahead. "You could walk away, you know," she said quietly. "You've done your job." Ron glanced at her, his expression hard. "And let the galaxy burn." Not a chance. She smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. Then let's hope we can outrun destiny. The engines roared to life, and the ship shot into the void. Behind them, the shadows of Zalora loomed, but ahead lay an uncertain future, one filled with danger, secrets, and the possibility of salvation. Betrayal. The unmarked vessel glided through the black expanse of space, its engines humming softly. Ron Taylor sat in the cockpit, his fingers resting lightly on the controls. The past few hours had been a blur, an ambush, a desperate escape, and now a race against time. But even as the ship sailed away from Zalora, Ron's instincts screamed that danger wasn't far behind. Behind him, Lishera sat in the co-pilot's seat, her silver skin glowing faintly in the dim light of the cockpit. She stared out at the stars, her expression distant. Ron had gotten used to her silence. But tonight, it unsettled him. "You're awfully quiet," he said, breaking the tension. Lishera turned to him, her glowing purple eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm thinking about how far this will go. How much more blood will be spilled." Ron leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. "As much as it takes to keep you alive." Her gaze softened. "It's not just about me, Captain. It's about the galaxy. Sometimes I wonder, is my life worth the cost?" Ron met her eyes, his voice firm. "If keeping you alive means stopping a galactic war, then yes, it's worth it." The moment lingered, but before either of them could say more, the ship's comm system crackled to life. The voice of Jenna, Ron's operations coordinator, came through, calm and professional. "Captain, this is HQ. We've located a safe house for you and the ambassador. It's on Revered Prime, a neutral colony far from any major trade routes. You'll be off the grid." Ron frowned. "Why do I feel like there's a but coming?" "There's no but," Jenna replied. "You'll have full support from the local agency outpost. They've already prepared for your arrival." Something about her tone put Ron on edge, but he kept his doubts to himself. "Fine. Send me the coordinates." The comm line went dead, and Ron set the ship's autopilot. Revered Prime appeared on the screen, a small green-blue planet on the outer edge of the galaxy. Remote, quiet, and seemingly perfect for laying low. "Safe house," Ron muttered. "That's a nice way of saying we're sitting ducks." Lishera didn't respond, her gaze once again fixed on the stars. Hours later, the ship touched down on Revered Prime. The landing pad was hidden in a dense jungle, the thick canopy overhead blocking out most of the sunlight. As Ron and Lishera disembarked, they were greeted by a team of agents dressed in local garb, blending seamlessly with the environment. One of them, a tall man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes, stepped forward. "Captain Taylor, Ambassador Lishera, welcome. I'm Director Lorne, head of operations here." Ron nodded, shaking the man's hand. "Thanks for the hospitality. Let's hope this place lives up to its reputation." Lorne smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It will. We've taken every precaution to ensure your safety." The safe house was a secure underground facility, equipped with advanced defenses and monitoring systems. Despite its remote location, it had everything they needed, except peace of mind. Ron walked the perimeter, inspecting the security setup. Everything seemed in order, but his unease only grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he returned to the main room, he found Lishera sitting in a meditative pose, her eyes closed and her breathing steady. She looked serene, but when she spoke, her voice was strained. "They're coming," she said quietly. Ron stiffened. "What do you mean? How do you know?" She opened her eyes, the faint glow in them brighter than before. "I can feel them. The people chasing me. They're relentless. They won't stop until they've caught me." Ron's jaw tightened. They won't get the chance. But even as he said the words, the sound of a distant explosion rocked the facility. Alarms blared, and Ron's comm buzzed with frantic voices. "Captain, we're under attack," one of the guards shouted. Ron grabbed his weapon, adrenaline surging. Leshera, stay here. Lock the doors, and don't let anyone in. She nodded, her face pale but determined. Be careful, Captain. Ron sprinted through the corridors, his weapon at the ready. He found Lorne near the control room, barking orders at his team. What's happening? Ron demanded. Lorne's face was grim. We've been compromised. A strike team breached the outer defenses. They're using cloaking tech. We didn't see them coming. Ron cursed under his breath. We need to get Leshera out of here. This place isn't secure anymore. Lorne hesitated, and for the first time, Ron noticed something in the man's eyes. Guilt. What aren't you telling me? Ron asked, his voice low and dangerous. Lorne sighed, avoiding Ron's gaze. I didn't have a choice. They found us before you even landed. They offered me a deal. Your lives in exchange for my people's safety. Rage boiled in Ron's chest. You sold us out. Lorne flinched. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I thought I could buy us time. Ron didn't wait for an explanation. He slammed Lorne against the wall, his voice a growl. You just signed our death warrants. Before Lorne could respond, another explosion rocked the facility, and the lights flickered. The attackers were inside. Ron released Lorne and sprinted back to Leshera's room. He found her standing in the center, her shield flickering as stray energy bolts hit the walls. We need to go, Ron said, grabbing her arm. What about the others? She asked. There's no time. He snapped. This whole place is compromised. They raced through the corridors, the sound of gunfire and shouting echoing around them. Ron's mind raced. He couldn't trust the safe house anymore, and the attackers were closing in. Their only option was to make it to the emergency ship and get off the planet. But as they reached the hangar, Ron's heart sank. The attackers were already there, blocking their path. Among them stood a familiar figure, the mercenary leader from the ambush. Going somewhere, the leader sneered. Ron raised his weapon, shielding Leshera with his body. You'll have to kill me first. The leader smirked, his weapon glowing with deadly energy. Gladly. The betrayal had brought them to the brink, but Ron wasn't about to give up. Not now, not ever. The fight for survival was just beginning. The rescue mission. Ron Taylor crouched behind a jagged outcrop of alien rock, his eyes fixed on the mercenary stronghold ahead. It loomed like a beast in the moonlight, an imposing fortress carved into the side of a mountain, with turrets that scanned the surrounding jungle for intruders. The facility was fortified, but Ron wasn't here to admire its defenses. He was here to break in and save Leshera. It had been 3 days since the betrayal at the safe house. 3 days since the mercenaries had taken her. Ron had barely escaped with his life, retreating into the dense jungles of Gervin Prime. He'd spent those days regrouping, gathering intel, and planning. Now, with the help of an unlikely ally, he was ready. Are you sure about this? A voice crackled in his earpiece. It belonged to Vega, a rogue AI Ron had encountered while scavenging for supplies. Vega had a grudge against the mercenaries. They had dismantled her original body during a raid, and she was eager for revenge. Ron smirked, adjusting the grip on his plasma rifle. Not even a little. But it's not like I have a choice. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and going in blind, Vega reminded him. Statistically speaking, your odds of survival are less than 5%. Then I'll make those 5% count, Ron muttered. Just keep the distraction going. Understood, Vega said. Initiating Phase 1. A distant explosion rocked the jungle as one of the facility's outer supply depots went up in flames. The mercenaries reacted instantly, their attention diverted as they scrambled to contain the fire. It was the opening Ron needed. He slipped through the shadows, moving with the precision of a predator. The jungle's dense foliage provided cover as he approached the fortress. When he reached the outer perimeter, he spotted a guard pacing near the entrance. Ron didn't hesitate. He lunged, striking the guard with a swift blow to the neck that rendered him unconscious. "Perimeter breach," Vega reported in his earpiece. "You're inside the grid. Watch for motion sensors." Ron nodded, slipping past the gates and into the maze-like compound. The interior was a stark contrast to the jungle outside. Cold metal walls lined with security cameras and robotic sentries patrolling the halls. He kept to the shadows, avoiding detection as he made his way deeper into the facility. Ron's first real challenge came at a heavily guarded checkpoint. Two mercenaries stood by a console, chatting casually while monitoring the camera feeds. Ron studied their movements, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When one of them turned to grab a drink, Ron acted. He fired his silenced pistol, dropping the first mercenary instantly. The second barely had time to react before Ron closed the distance, slamming him against the console and knocking him out. "Clear," Ron whispered. "Nice work," Vega said. "I've tapped into their network. Lishera is being held in the central chamber, top level, but you've got a problem." "Let me guess," Ron said, already moving. "More guards." "Try an entire platoon," Vega replied. "And the leader of the mercenaries is with them. He's not going to make this easy for you." Ron grimaced. "He's welcome to try." The central chamber was a massive circular room with a high ceiling and a single raised platform in the middle. Lishera was there, restrained in a glowing containment field that crackled with energy. She looked unharmed but exhausted, her shimmering robes dulled and her eyes dim. Around the platform stood a dozen heavily armed mercenaries, their weapons trained on the room's entrances. At the far end, the mercenary leader paced, his crimson armor gleaming under the harsh lights. "We know you're here, Taylor," the leader called out, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But this ends now." Ron stayed hidden, his mind racing as he formulated a plan. He couldn't take them all head-on. He'd be cut down before he even reached Lishera. He needed a diversion. "Vega," he whispered, "can you kill the lights?" "Already on it," the AI replied. 3, 2, 1. The chamber was plunged into darkness, and chaos erupted. The mercenaries shouted in confusion, their weapons firing blindly. Ron moved swiftly, using his visor's night vision to navigate the room. He took out the guards one by one, his movements precise and lethal. By the time the lights flickered back on, half the mercenaries were down, and Ron was on the platform. He deactivated the containment field, catching Lishera as she collapsed into his arms. "Captain," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with relief. "I've got you," Ron said. "But we're not out of this yet." The mercenary leader roared in anger, charging toward them with his massive weapon raised. Ron pushed Lishera behind him, his plasma rifle aimed at the approaching threat. "Go," Ron shouted. "I'll hold him off." "No," Lishera said, summoning her remaining strength. She stepped forward, her hands glowing with the same energy she'd used during the ambush. "We do this together." The leader hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the display of power. It was all the opening Ron needed. He fired a well-placed shot, hitting the leader's weapon and disabling it. At the same time, Lishera unleashed a wave of energy that sent the remaining guards flying. The leader dropped to his knees, defeated but alive. Ron approached, his weapon trained on the man. "Who sent you?" he demanded. The leader smirked. "You think this ends here? You have no idea what you're up against." Ron knocked him out with a swift blow, turning back to Lishera. "We need to move. More will be coming." Lishera nodded, leaning on him as they made their way out of the fortress. Vega's voice crackled in Ron's ear. "I've disabled their comms and security systems. You've got a clean exit, if you hurry." As they boarded the escape vessel and soared into the night sky, Ron glanced at Lishera. "You okay?" She smiled faintly, her glow returning. "Thanks to you." Ron nodded, but his mind was already on the next move. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The wild turn. The escape vessel glided through the void of space, its engines humming softly as it moved farther from Pervin Prime. Inside, Ron Taylor leaned against the cockpit console, exhaustion etched into his features. He had barely slept in days, and the weight of his responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. Lishara sat across from him, her silver skin shimmering faintly in the dim cabin light. Her glowing purple eyes were filled with gratitude but also fear. The fight for her life, and the galaxy's future, was far from over. "I still don't understand how they tracked us so easily," Ron muttered, his voice laced with frustration. "We've been careful. We've avoided major routes, changed ships twice." Lishara hesitated, then sighed. "It's me, Captain. My DNA doesn't just carry the Eternium protocol. It emits a faint signal. Only those who know what to look for can trace it." Ron's eyes narrowed. "You're saying we've been broadcasting our location this whole time?" "Not intentionally," she said, her voice soft. "The signal is encoded so deeply that even I wasn't fully aware of it, but they must have the technology to detect it." Ron groaned, running a hand through his hair. "Great. So no matter where we go, they'll keep coming." Lishara's gaze dropped to her hands. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to put you in this position." Ron straightened, his voice firm. "We'll figure it out. There has to be a way to stop this." As the ship approached the rendezvous point, a derelict space station hidden in an asteroid belt, Ron's comlink crackled. It was Vega, the rogue AI who had helped them escape the mercenary stronghold. "Captain," Vega's synthetic voice said, "I've done some digging. You're not going to like what I found." "Lay it on me," Ron replied, steering the ship into the station's docking bay. "The Eternium protocol isn't just a weapon or a beacon," Vega explained. "It's also a failsafe. If activated improperly, it could trigger a chain reaction that destabilizes nearby star systems." Ron froze, his hands tightening on the controls. "Are you saying this thing could destroy entire systems?" "Yes," Vega confirmed. "And the group after Lishara knows this. They're not just trying to control the protocol. They're planning to use it as leverage. Imagine the galaxy held hostage under the threat of annihilation." Ron's jaw clenched. "We can't let that happen." "You'll need to decide quickly," Vega continued. "They're closing in on your location. I intercepted a signal. They're planning a full assault." The station was dark and eerie, its long abandoned corridors echoing with their footsteps. Ron led Lishara to the central control room, where Vega had uploaded herself into the station's systems. Holographic displays flickered to life, showing maps of the asteroid belt and the approaching enemy fleet. "We don't have much time," Vega said. "Their ships will be here in less than an hour." Ron studied the maps, his mind racing. "What about the signal? Can we block it?" "No," Vega replied. "But there's another option. The protocol's signal can be amplified and redirected. If we can lure them into the asteroid belt, I can create a feedback loop that disables their systems." Lishara frowned. "That sounds dangerous." "It is," Vega admitted. "If anything goes wrong, the station could be destroyed, and you with it." Ron turned to Lishara. "What do you think? It's your call." She hesitated, her glowing eyes reflecting the flickering holograms. "If it stops them, it's worth the risk." Ron nodded. "Then let's do it." The next hour was a flurry of preparation. Ron rigged the station's defenses while Vega worked to amplify the protocol signal. Lishara assisted where she could, her calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions she felt. As the enemy fleet closed in, the tension in the station grew palpable. Ron stood at the main console, watching the displays as the ships entered the asteroid belt. "They're in position," Vega reported, activating the feedback loop. "Now." The station shuddered as a pulse of energy rippled through the asteroid belt. The enemy ships faltered, their systems sparking and failing. But before Ron could celebrate, alarms blared. "Something's wrong," Vega said. "The feedback loop is overloading the station's core." Ron cursed under his breath. Can you stabilize it? I'm trying, Vega replied. But it's going to blow unless you shut it down manually. Ron didn't hesitate. Lishera, stay here. Vega, guide me to the core. No, Lishera said, grabbing his arm. You can't do this alone. Ron shook his head. You're the key to everything. If you die, the galaxy is finished. This is my job. Let me do it. Her eyes glistened, but she nodded. Be careful. Ron sprinted through the station's corridors, the walls trembling as the core grew unstable. He reached the control chamber, a maze of wires and glowing panels, and began working to shut down the loop. Captain, you need to hurry, Vega urged. The core is critical. I'm almost there, Ron replied, his hands flying over the controls. Back in the control room, Lishera watched the displays with bated breath. The enemy fleet was retreating, their ships crippled, but the station's core was seconds away from collapse. Just as the countdown hit 0, the trembling stopped. The station stabilized, its systems humming back to life. He did it, Vega said. The core is stable. Lishera exhaled in relief, tears streaming down her cheeks as Ron's voice came through the comm. Mission accomplished, he said, his tone weary but triumphant. Now, let's get out of here. As the ship left the station, Ron and Lishera sat side by side in the cockpit. The galaxy was safe, for now, but the road ahead was still uncertain. You saved billions today, Lishera said softly. Thank you. Ron glanced at her, a faint smile on his lips. Just another day on the job. As the stars stretched into infinity before them, Ron couldn't help but feel that their fight was far from over. But for the first time in days, he allowed himself a moment of peace.